Hi, we continue in 1 Samuel 30 today, after David has divided his 600 men into 400 who continue to pursue those who have raided his town of Ziklag, and 200, too exhausted to cross the Wadi Besor, stay behind. And as we begin our passage today, we are out in the open country. And one of the things that we'll see that's very different about this section of 1 Samuel 30 is we've been seeing a lot of detail of places, as you can see on the right side of the screen. But suddenly, in this section, it's completely vague. In the open country, wherever that is, literally, as we'll see, and you can see now, in the field. But what field? And when David asked the Egyptian to take him down to where the raiding party was, we're not clear at all where they're going. So this intermediate scene here, before we get to, in chapter 31, the battle on the mountain of Gilboa between the Philistines and the Israelites that ended up killing Saul and Jonathan, we have this strangely vague section here before David decides to go and rescue his family, his wives, and everything else from Ziklag. So if you haven't been watching the videos here, I want to highlight at least this point. I'd encourage you, if you haven't watched it, to go back and watch the introductory video to 1 Samuel 27 to 31, where I go over a number of these issues in detail. But for the moment, what's important is the story we're reading here in chapter 30 is simultaneous chronologically with the story in chapter 28 and in 31. And I've looked at that, the reasons for that in the last couple of videos, and I won't go over it again today, other than we'll note that the third day issue here will parallel a third day issue over here that we'll see in just a moment when we compare the report that we see in our scene today from the Egyptian who was a slave of an Amalekite, and in 2 Samuel 1, where an Amalekite himself gives testimony to David about Saul's death, which is very different. So we'll be comparing those scenes in just a minute. In our key words, there's not a lot going on in this section. We saw in the beginning the framing of burning down Ziklag, and of course he notes that here, the Egyptian slave notes that here, and it'll be, Ziklag won't be unburned, but everything that was taken will be returned, we'll see down here. And right now we're in the midst of the chiasm that covers chapter 30 verses 1 to 20. So you can see there in this section right at the center of it as we'll continue on. This is part of the larger chiasm we've been looking at in the second half of 1 Samuel. So now we're down to this part with the end of this Philistine's rejection of David in chapter 29 and his rescue of the two wives parallel to his wife Michal up here and Jonathan's love for him there. So with the key words up, let's enter into our passage. And as we do, I guess before we look at the key words, I want to highlight this parallel I was just referring to here. So here's the first 5 verses of our passage, and then we have down here the first 6 verses of the next chapter. Chapter 30 does not end here. I want to highlight that. Chapter 30 goes on another 10 verses or so. But this section here that we're going to look at today is certainly parallel to this section over here. And you can see the color-coordinated places to highlight that in both cases someone's been wandering for 3 days in a bad condition. David asks, to whom do you belong? Where are you from? And we see it twice here, where are you from? And he interestingly gives a different answer in both times. When we get to 2 Samuel 1, we'll look at that there. And the question of whether David would kill them or not, the Egyptian we meet today recognizes the risk and makes David swear that he won't kill him. The Amalekite does not recognize the risk and ends up dead. And then the light blue parts here are the 2 different versions of the death of Saul, which are certainly mutually inconsistent, and we'll have to look at that when we do. And then finally, the green part is important here where the person identifies himself, and it's obviously connected. I am a young man of Egypt, servant to an Amalekite, and over here, this person is an Amalekite. So the Amalekites are certainly in the situation here, and that's going to lead us to have to go back a little bit. So before we do that, before we look at our passage, let's go back and see what is it about Amalek that had gotten Samuel so exercised over it back in chapter 15, a chapter that we've seen recalled several times. And when we look at the story of Saul with the woman of Endor in chapter 28, after we finish this chapter, we'll see that that's the one thing that Samuel brings up, is you didn't destroy Amalek. So where does that come from? We have to look back to both to Exodus and to Deuteronomy to understand this. And as we do, both of these texts and what we're seeing in 1 Samuel as a follow-up of that are plainly what I call the religion of empire texts. They're texts that are part of a worldview, and here's the general structure of both the religion of empire and the religion of creation from my book, Come Out My People. And I don't want to focus on my book as such, but I want to highlight here for those who are listening to this set of videos here that The religion of empire are texts that within the Bible are part of the argument that our Israelite ancestors had over who Yahweh was and what kind of people they were meant to be. And I would note that that same set of arguments exists certainly in my country, the United States, now. So in this case, let's look at the Exodus 17 one first, and then we'll look at the Deuteronomy, and then I'll make that connection. So we hear this in Exodus 17:14-16. Then Yahweh said to Moses, "Write this as a reminder in a book and recite it in the hearing of Joshua. I will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven." And Moses built an altar and called it "Yahweh is my banner." He said, "A hand upon the banner of Yahweh. Yahweh will have war with Amalek from generation to generation." In fact, let's look at the Deuteronomy one at the same time so we can hear them both together. So this is Moses speaking on the edge of the Jordan to those who are going to cross over into the Promised Land. "Remember what Amalek did to you on your way out of Egypt, how he attacked you on the way when you were faint and weary and struck down all who lagged behind you. He did not fear God. Therefore, when Yahweh your God has given you rest from all your enemies on every hand, in the land that Yahweh your God is giving you as an inheritance to possess, you shall blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget." So divine command in both situations to completely destroy this set of people. And that's as blatant a religion of empire perspective as we can see. And I don't want to get all into Exodus and Deuteronomy here, but when I say that, I want to highlight that just as the United States today, some people would blame immigrants or foreigners in whatever level for our problems, or suggest that we should be destroying countries that don't support us. Certainly Israel in the ancient world, and sadly Israel in the modern world, have people who continue to support that view. But they were never the only voice. And as I've been noting, if this section of 1 Samuel, or perhaps all of 1 Samuel, is from an exilic or post-exilic time under Persian rule, there were certainly many religion of creation texts that were contrary to this in shaping what would be the post-exilic or even post-Persian way of life in Jerusalem and the environs. Genesis is a classic example where it says that all people are made in the image and likeness of God, and so therefore there's no excuse to have anybody as an enemy, and certainly not an excuse to destroy people in the name of God. So I just want to highlight at the beginning here that if you are watching this as a Jesus follower, for example, Jesus unquestionably took up the religion of creation and condemned the religion of empire, and he condemns it in the strongest possible terms by saying it's associated with the devil. We see that so clearly in the Synoptic Gospels when Jesus goes out into the wilderness after being baptized in the Jordan and hearing the voice from God that tells him that Jesus is God's beloved Son, but then he faces the devil who tells him that all the kingdoms of the world are in his hands and that he has the authority to give them to Jesus if Jesus will only worship him. So the New Testament view plainly is that empires are functions of the devil. They are not God's kingdom, and that's the contrast. That the reign or kingdom of God is a peaceable kingdom, whether that's in the images of the laying down with the lamb that we see in ancient texts like Isaiah, or in all the images of love and forgiveness and reconciliation we see in the New Testament, whether in the Gospels or in the authentic writings of Paul. So as we look at this story, if you're a follower of Jesus, we can't really call this scripture in the sense that these are not the God of Jesus commands. These are arguments from a different view that God wants the Israelites to have a powerful empire, or at least not be around other peoples who might cause them trouble. So with that context, let's enter into our story here, starting in verse 11, and we'll see the role of Amalek here, and then again in 2 Samuel 1. So, in the open country, literally in the field, as I was saying, they found an Egyptian. How do they know he's an Egyptian? Presumably from his clothes, although if he's a slave, he probably wouldn't have honorific Egyptian clothes, but they recognized him and brought him to David. They gave him bread and he ate, and they gave him water to drink, and they also gave him a piece of fig cake and 2 clusters of raisins. Some scholars who are so seeking to want to praise David see this as merciful, and perhaps it's merciful, or perhaps David recognizes this guy might have some information we need, and unless he can get fed and watered and revived, he's not going to provide any information for us. So, as so often with David, the intentions are ambiguous, and scholars who want to praise David see this as good, and scholars who are suspicious of David see it otherwise. The piece of fig cake and the 2 clusters of raisins certainly recalls what Abigail gave to David and his men back in chapter 25. You can see from my note below. Very specific there. And when he'd eaten, his spirit revived, or literally his breath returned, or his spirit returned. His spirit couldn't have returned because he wasn't dead. So in this sense, his breath returned, as Jonathan's did after he ate the honey that his father had forbidden him from eating back in chapter 14. And the narrator explains where he had not eaten bread or drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. So that's the part that connects us here, as we'll see, with the third day that the Amalek man comes from Saul's camp in 2 Samuel 1. So now, moving down our story a little bit, then David said to him, "To whom do you belong?" And it's an interesting question. Literally, as you see from my note below, the two questions could be translated, "To whom are you, and where, and what this?" There's actually 3 questions within the 2 there. So basically, tell me what's going on here. Who are you? And he answers him quite plainly. "I am a young man, a Na'ar," as we've seen used regularly, "of Egypt." It's an unlikely situation here, an Egyptian servant to an Amalekite. From the map, we can certainly see that Amalek down here was a loosely organized desert people. We never see them in anything like with cities or a centralized organization. That we don't know a lot about them apart from the Bible, but they seem to be a Bedouin or nomadic group that make these raids on these areas down here and were interfered with the Israelites, according to the story of Exodus, coming from the south of Egypt, coming up in this way. But Amalek is a small local thing compared to Egypt, which at this time was a great empire. Such a great empire that, as we'll see when we look later in 2 Samuel and toward 1 Kings, that there's a good argument to be made that some scholars have made that Solomon is made king because the Egyptians want him to be king. And some of the iconography of the Jerusalem temple that he builds is evidence of that. So it's a very curious thing here to see an Egyptian subject to an Amalekite, although it's not all that different than what we see in Genesis when the Egyptian Hagar is subject to Sarai and Abram, although we know the reason for that in that story. Here we do not know the reason. In any event, that's who he is, and he says, "My master," or "my lord, left me behind because I fell sick." Literally, the word means weak or sick, and some scholars note the contrast here between the Amalekites attacking the Israelites when the Israelites were weak, and now the Amalekite has left behind a weak Egyptian. And again, the emphasis on 3 days ago. Then he continues, "We," and notice it doesn't say they, he considers himself a part of it, "we made a raid on the Negeb of the Cherethites," and Negeb again just means south. Cherethites, although Samora here suggests related to Cretan and sometimes a synonym for the Philistines, citing Ezekiel and Zephaniah. As we'll see in this context in 2 Samuel, they're more likely to be one of 2 groups that worked as mercenaries, at least under David's reign. But regardless of who they specifically are, they're down here in the south, and also the Negev, which belongs to Judah, highlighting that the Amalekites actually did attack Judah, unlike David, who told King Achish of the Philistines that he did, but that we saw he hadn't really. So they're attacking the Cherethites and the Negev that belongs to Judah, and the Negev of Caleb, also in the south, and we burned Ziklag down. And David doesn't question any of that, but asks, "Will you take me down to the raiding party?" And this is where the Amalekite young man recognizes what's at issue. Although we have no reason to think he knows who David is. David has not identified himself. Why would he know who this group of men are? Other than perhaps because he was part of the fight, perhaps he heard his slave master telling him something, but we don't know really how he would know. But he is afraid, and he demands, "Swear to me by God," Elohim here, not Yahweh, "that you will not kill me or hand me over to my master," or literally, "deliver me to the hand of my Lord, and I will take you down to them," literally to this raiding party. And as I've noted on my keywords chart, we see that a number of times. Notice we don't hear any response from David. He makes David swear, but we don't hear that David did swear. We just simply hear the story continue here. So that's the end of this parallel here, and then we'll come back to this in another video when we get to chapter 31. So now when he had taken them down, we see this hedonistic display. They were spread out all over the ground, eating and drinking and dancing. The Hebrew here is even more that case. Vahenna, behold, they were left on the face of all the earth, or as Robert Alter suggests, they were sprawled out all over the ground. Bodder notes it entails a sense of reckless abandon. So here are these Amalekites who are just enjoying all the spoils that they've gotten, eating and drinking and dancing, and here comes David. And notice how it's made to sound like it's a one-man operation here. Not David and his 400 men, but David himself attacked them for 24 hours, from the beginning of the day till the end of to the next day, which is to say, in the Israelite conception of day that begins in evening at twilight until the evening of the next day. And it's while they're drunk, recalling Nabal, who dies while he was drunk, back in chapter 25. So the second parallel to to David dealing with fools. Here they're fools because they're not alert to the fact that David may be coming after them, which he obviously does. And it's such a one-sided battle that we hear not one of them escaped except for 400, which is a good number to be escaping, but we don't hear anything of any of David's men being killed. So what kind of scene are we expecting to see? So starting at night in the dark, David attacks these drunken, full of food and such people, and they're all killed except 400 who get away, and nobody from David's 400 is left. And if they had 400 who got away, how many of them were there in the first place? David only had 400 in the first place. So it seems like the Amalekites had outnumbered them, but because they were drunk and not alert, that David was able to take them all. And then strangely, we're told for the only time in Genesis that people mounted camels, or not in Genesis, I'm sorry, in 1 Samuel, that people mounted camels and fled. In Genesis, we see that Rebekah mounts a camel on her way to meet her about-to-be husband, Isaac. But camels in this world were not mounted. They were there to carry baggage, as they do in Genesis 24, before, on the way back, Rebekah decides to ride the camel. But that's anachronistic in the time period. Another thing suggesting that perhaps this is a late text. So the 400 young men mounted their camels and fled, and then we hear the close, as Sumura notes, that narrator emphasized that David was the major figure, if not the only one. And the New RSV covers over the pairing of rescuing here, so you can see it in my parallel on the right side. He rescued all that the Amalekites had taken, and David rescued his 2 wives. And notice how much detail the narrator provides to highlight the fullness of it. Nothing was missing, whether small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything that had been taken. David brought back everything. Now we know that can't be true. We know that the Amalekites obviously were drinking and eating and enjoying all that stuff, and presumably they were enjoying the spoils that they'd just taken. So he couldn't take back the things that they'd already consumed, and he certainly couldn't take back whatever the 400 on their camels had taken with him. But the narrator's not here trying to express factual accuracy. It's trying to say something about David, that David, in a sense of reversing the exile, as we saw 2 videos ago, that the first verses of this chapter really highlight language that makes it seem like an exilic situation, from the people being taken captive, the city being burned down, etc. And so now David, in a sense, is being portrayed for an exilic or post-exilic audience as a means for reversing the exile, which is to say, if we had a king like David again, we might be okay. And when we get to 2 Samuel 7, we'll see where that long-term hope comes from. Even though after the exile there was no restored Davidic monarchy, that promise of a Davidic king goes all the way into the New Testament, when the gospel writers try to trace Jesus back to a Davidic origin. So these promises and images of David as the one who's the hero, not only of the past, but the model for a hero of the future, is established in scenes like this. And so for our final verse for today here, 2 verses, David also captured, notice it's described separately, and the verb here is took, what kings do, all the flocks and herds which are driven ahead of the other cattle, and people said, we don't know which people, certainly not the Amalekites, and who have gone, and is this his own people? Who else is saying this? We'll find out later in the chapter who it might be, but they wouldn't be saying it yet because David hasn't gone to them. So if you can hold that in your mind for another video or so, we'll see it later in the chapter. This is David's spoil. As Brueggemann notes, the Amalekites are resented for taking spoil. Saul is rejected for taking spoil. David is saluted and championed for doing the same. David is subject to none of the restrictions, held accountable to none of the old norms. And that is often the case, especially when David can cover his tracks. But there's no tracks being covered here. This is a blatantly open situation where David is taking the spoil. But what spoil is it? He's taken back everything that the Amalekites had taken. Presumably what it means, he's taking things that the Amalekites had beyond the spoil. So in addition to this section noting he'd rescued all that was taken, here now it's noting, even though it doesn't say so explicitly, that these flocks and herds are the Amalekite ones that he's taken. And then we come back to what closes this. Then David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to follow and had been left at the brook Besor, and they went out to meet David and to meet the people who were with him. And when David drew near to the people, he saluted them. Then we're going to see there's a great resentment from those who worked hard and risked their lives against those who rested. And we'll see how David establishes himself in the eyes of the authors, if not of the readers, as a just king who can resolve this and reconcile his people. We'll see that next time. See you then.